Yeah, so first of all, thank you to the Volt guys for inviting me for this lecture about hamstring injury prevention in a football setting. I think it's fantastic, even in these COVID times, to be able to share some knowledge. And although we are both on different sides of the world, we can still discuss this topic and share some information about hamstring injury prevention in a football setting. So looking forward to this. And the reason I'm probably here is because of some research I did. I did a PhD on the prevention of hamstring injuries in soccer, focusing mainly on eccentric training as a preventive method and some return to play research. And but I'm also a sports physiotherapist, so I consider myself partly a researcher and partly a sports physio. And as a sports physio, I work for the Dutch Football Association, where I'm mainly responsible for the rehabilitation of injured elite players. Uh, Mostly those are guys with ACLs or hamstring injuries or cartilage problems, and they do their rehabilitation here. And besides that, I'm also trying to give some hope to the Dutch national flag, because we've never won the World Cup. But we're going to in about 15 years. There will be some hope both on the men's end and the women's end. So in 2040, be aware, we'll win the World Cup finally. So my idea for today is mainly to share some knowledge about the current base of evidence surrounding hamstring injury prevention, but also to look to the future and see where some possibilities are about hamstring injury prevention, and where there might be some interesting research projects that we're looking forward to in the next 5 to 10 years, which might have an impact on this topic and improve our clinical work with athletes and football players, and improve hamstring injury prevention as a domain in sports injury prevention. Because we only have 25 to 30 minutes, I'm looking to more sort of inspire and look towards the research rather than going into deep on the topic, because there's not enough time to discuss the whole part. So yeah, and for today, I thought I'd start with Simon Sinek. Some of you might have heard about him. He's always saying, start with why. And I think that's a great starting point. So we're going to start with why today, and from there on move to the process and the product. So start with why. And why is this important? Why is hamstring injury prevention important? Why should we focus on it? Because on each average Champions League team, you might have 5 injured players at each given time point in the season. And translating this to percentages, there's about 14% absence of players with a training availability of about 77% and a match availability of 86% on average. And translating this to the amount of injuries per season, you have about 50 to 55 time loss injuries per season, which is a lot. Of course, it means that you have 2 to 3 injuries per player per season. And this has an impact on your performance, on your salary cap, on your individual players, on their health status. So injuries are an important part of sports performance. We should not only look at the injury incidence or the injury severity. Well, what Bar made a great publication about is we should also focus on the burden of injuries, which is sort of the severity and the incidence combined. Because if we look at injury severity, of course, the ACLs are on top. These are injuries that have a significant impact on our players. Usually you're away for about 6 to 12 months. In Italy, it might be 5. But it takes a long while, and you're absent from play for a long while. So it's an intensive rehabilitation, sometimes a career-ending injury. And these are on top with regards to injury severity. And on the lower right of this picture, you'll see the lower leg contusions, which happen a lot, but usually you'll be fine within a few days and you'll be able to play very fast again. So those have a high incidence, but less impact and less injury severity. But looking at the muscle injuries, and especially the hamstring muscle injury, you see that there is both a high incidence and a high injury severity. So hamstring injuries are a big problem in football. It takes players to get about a month to get back on average. It's about 4 to 6 weeks if you have a significant hamstring muscle injury. And usually these hamstring injuries occur frequently throughout the season. So yeah, the impact is quite high for this injury on your team. And they also affect team performance negatively. So there was a publication by Martin Hägglund and his co-workers where they analyzed the Champions League data. And from this data, they showed that if you have a lower injury burden, it's associated with a higher match availability and also with more points per match and more success in the Europa League or the Champions League. And this has also been confirmed in a systematic review by Drew, who looked at sporting success and then made a definition of sporting success, obviously. But he also showed the association between a high match availability and team success in various sports. So it's important to acknowledge that injuries are not only a problem for the individual player who's injured and who's out of play for quite a while, it's also a problem on a team level because the sports performance is declining, which might also be a problem for the whole club. And I think I took an example. This was the salary paid to injured players for last year in the English Premier League. You can see a lot of the money that's spent on injured players here. And one thing that's obvious is that Sheffield United didn't pay that much. And of course, their salary is lower compared to some other teams, but they also had significantly less injuries than the other teams. And making the translation to the league table again, you can see that even a club with a low salary cap and maybe not the best players in the league, although you can always have a discussion about that, but Sheffield United will probably not have the best players around, can still finish quite well on the league table. And they attributed this also to the low numbers of injuries they had that season. And there's even a more beautiful fairy tale here. It's somewhat of a fairy tale, of course. Maybe some of you will remember the Premier League in 2015-2016 season, where Leicester City, who was also a team that didn't have the highest salary cap, didn't have maybe the best players, but they finished quite high on the league table. They were the champions that season. And looking at the numbers behind it, and they also attributed their success to the availability, the high match availability of players, which made it possible for their trainer to work on their tactics, work with the same starting 11 most of the time. And yeah, you can see here the numbers of that season. Few players were injured, more players were, or less players were used, and even the fastest players were in the team, which from a hamstring injury perspective, we know that the hamstring injury usually occurs in the higher speed zones. Is an obvious consideration. So starting with why, I think it's quite obvious that there's a big why you should pay some attention to hamstring injury prevention in a football setting. There's personal suffering of the injured player, of course, which is probably the most important aspect. You want to help the player and he should be playing football. He should not spend his time on rehab. It's also one of the most prevalent injuries with the highest injury burden. And it costs a lot of money. Players are getting injured, and especially with the high salary caps of players these days, yeah, that's a problem for clubs as well. And it decreases performance, which again is a problem for the clubs and a problem for the trainer, for instance. So a lot of whys. Then moving on to the how. So we know now why to do it, but how should we do it? What's important in the process part of hamstring injury prevention? And I'm not getting any money for this. Feel free to spend money, Nike, if you see this presentation, but it's not gonna happen. I put this slide in because I think their quote is fantastic. Just do it. If you talk about hamstring injury prevention, just do it. And I think that's the starting point and maybe also the end point of how to make injury prevention work. Do it. And yeah, if we look at the evidence surrounding hamstring injury prevention and doing it, we can see this publication by Robert Barr, again from the Champions League data. And in this data, we saw that although there was a lot of evidence supporting the effectiveness of some prevention strategies for hamstring injuries, still it was not being done. And this study was done on the Nordics. Only 10% in an elite football setting were fully compliant to a Nordic program, and 83% were non-compliant, which is a lot. And in Holland, we did some studies on amateur football, and it was the same. The numbers were even lower. We had about 4 to 6% fully compliant population, but yeah, again, significantly more were not compliant to the hamstring injury prevention schedule. And we asked the players, the coaches, the medical staffs, like, what do you need? When would you think would you do the hamstring injury prevention program? And yeah, they sort of had some main topics, which were personal motivation. They all stated that if they were personally motivated to do the program, they would go and probably do it. They needed the knowledge of the Nordics. And this was for both the players, the coaches, and the medical staff members. Coaches and medical staff members also wanted to know about the effectiveness of the Nordics program. How much would it work? How would it keep their players safe? And the medical staff members also talked about consensus with the staff and the player motivation again, which they said were important for them as drivers to do the program. This would still be interesting to follow up on this because, again, this raises questions. When is a player, for instance, personally motivated to do the program? But it's obvious, at least the main point here as well, is that the main point here is that the players are not compliant, both in a professional setting and in an amateur setting. And this is something that is not only, I think, a problem for hamstring injury prevention, but maybe on a broader perspective as well. And in sports science, we are looking to optimize implementation, of course. We're looking to optimize adoption of the programs, but this is more of a behavioral science problem than a sports science problem. And I think we need to collaborate here to see how what drives people. When will they start prevention? I always make the link to smoking. I think everybody knows smoking is not too well for your health, but nonetheless, people are smoking. And why is this? What makes them start smoking, and why can't they adhere to non-smoking? Yeah, it's an interesting topic, and I think this is really important to have a better understanding of what drives people to adopt prevention in a real world setting. From a clinical perspective, from my work in football, I think one thing to make implementation work is really communicate well. We as a medical staff need to facilitate the coach to facilitate the players, because ultimately it's mainly the coach that drives prevention. He makes the most of the programs, always in consideration with the medical staff, obviously, but still he's one of the key members regarding this topic. And I think that we need to give him the knowledge, provide him with the tools, provide him with the schedules, and he can make the players do it. And that means that we also need to look at our communication. Maybe we need to talk to the coach in a different manner than we talk to our colleagues. So talk about, for instance, match availability instead of the injury numbers. You can say to a coach, like, we have 6 injuries, and this is an injury with diagnosis A, and this is an injury with diagnosis B. But he won't be interested. He's more interested towards, how many players do I have available? I have my favorite first 11, and if only 6 players of that favorite first 11 are available, you should know that there's a problem. And also with the physical testing, we could talk about physical tests, name the test and the outcomes, but maybe it's more important to talk about performance. For instance, talk about sprint capacity, talk about physical fitness. So our language is really important here, and you can already see this a little bit because some clubs have adopted a performance department, instead of a medical department. Don't know if this is a good thing, but the language matters here. That's the point. So we know why, we know we need to do it, and at least do it better than we're doing it right now. And then we're continuing towards the what. So what do we need to do? I think this is also the right way to go, because if you don't have the why in the process, if you don't know the motivation and what, optimize the process, the what's never coming out. And if you have the why and the how in place, the what is easy. You'll just give it and the product will do the work. So talking about what do we need to do? I think this publication in 2012 was fantastic from Jordan Medigucha, where he sort of had a hamstring strain injury model, claiming that there's not a single risk factor. It's not about only strength. It's not about only previous injury or core stability. It's about the interaction of all the factors, and it's a multidimensional injury, of course, a multifactorial injury. So we also need to consider multiple factors and also the interaction between factors, and even the changeability of those factors in time, because somebody might have a non-optimal strength level at the beginning of the season, but maybe after some work or after some training in the mid-season, this will be different, and it's important to monitor the difference, the differences in time with regards to each factor. And this publication sort of was followed up by Oakley in 2018. He talked about holistic hamstring health, which is, I think, a fantastic term. You can give your own interpretation of holistic hamstring health and what it incorporates, but the main aspects here are strength and running, and there's also some flexibility in there. But I think those aspects are the ones that there's evidence for right now, and it requires an active approach, which is, for me, the way to go when we're talking about hamstring injury prevention. It should be 90 to 95% should be active prevention. So coming from an active prevention perspective, I think there are 4 topics that we do in practice, or we could do in practice. I have here outlined some pictures, but we're talking about core stability, we're talking about plyometrics, we're talking about eccentric strength, and we're talking about sprinting. And I'll touch upon those topics briefly from here on. So core stability is always a difficult one for me as well. When you talk about core, what is the core? We're usually talking about the lumbopelvic area, or the center of mass for us, or everybody has a different definition. But it's not like we're an avocado like this picture here, where we have a core and there's something around it. I think it's an interactive whole, where core stability and the definition of core stability should probably go towards optimizing the stability in different movements, and also incorporating different components of the body. It's not only the lumbopelvic area, but also the translation of forces towards the lower extremities or the upper extremities. So it's really difficult to define, which makes it even more difficult to measure. And that's probably why there's almost no evidence on core stability yet. And Tony Shield, I think he put it best. He said that although there's a widespread acceptance in elite sports that lumbopelvic stability is an important and modifiable risk factor for hamstring injuries, there's, he said, only modest evidence. I think there's almost no evidence for this belief. And there are certainly no specific exercises recommended to improve stability or to measure stability. So, it doesn't mean that in a clinical setting you should not use core stability. You should probably work with it, but we still don't know exactly what it is, how to define it, and how to put it in clinical practice as a concept, and how it relates to, for instance, hamstring injury prevention. So a difficult topic, in my opinion. We also talked a little bit about plyometrics, and Sander van der Hoef, who's a Dutch PhD, he actually received his PhD last week, which is September of 2020. where he sort of, in Holland we had a Nordic program, and there was some critic with the Nordic program where they said like, it's a fantastic program and we know it works, but it's not functional and nobody wants to do it, so we need to develop something else. And from that perspective, Sander developed the bounding program, where players started with walking lunges, moved on to triplings and drop lunges, and ultimately had a bounding program. And the idea was that this plyometric exercise program would have a preventive effect for hamstring injuries as well, and would be adopted better by the teams because it's more functional. But unfortunately, his results didn't show that in his study. He did a big RCT and he showed a 71% compliance with the program, which was, compared to the Nordics, not that high. And there was no effect. There was no significant difference between the control group and the group who did the bounding program. So you can read all this about about this in his PhD thesis, which is really interesting because he looked at plyometrics related to injury prevention and also a little bit towards performance. So this is a real interesting PhD to have a look at, but it also confirmed that the plyometric exercise program did not have a significant preventive effect on hamstring injuries. So a quick conclusion here is that core stability, we don't know how it works in hamstring injury prevention, and plyometrics, at least the bounding exercise program, is not effective. So that means we have to get back to the eccentrics. I think most of you will already know some of the literature surrounding the eccentric exercises, and sprinting, of course, as a hamstring injury prevention tool. So these two tools, starting with the eccentric part, why is it important? And most of the hamstring injuries in football occur during sprinting. And the hypothetical model surrounding this, why it happens, the etiology, coming from the biomechanics, says that in sprinting you have a submaximal stretch over the hamstrings, both over the hip joint and over the knee joint, because you have a flexion in the hip joint and an extension in the knee joint. And this occurs in the late swing phase or the beginning of the stance phase. And at the same time, the lower leg, of course, is swinging forward during sprinting, and the hamstrings have to counter this forward swinging motion of the lower leg. And this is an eccentric contraction of the hamstrings. And the higher the forces are, the higher the speed is, the higher the forces on the hamstrings are again. So yeah, ultimately with higher sprinting speeds comes a higher injury risk for hamstrings. And yeah, like I said, this has been associated with the amount of eccentric strength, because you need the eccentric strength to counter these forward swinging motions of the lower leg. And ultimately, looking at the model why eccentric strength might work as a preventive tool for hamstring injuries, is because here I've displayed a force length curve for you. If you look at this curve, you'll see that in a max flexion or max extension state of the hamstrings over the knee joint, for instance, you don't have that much strength. But coming to an optimal angle, which is probably around 30 to 40 degrees of flexion in the knee joint, you'll have the optimal strength level. So you'll be able to counter the most weight in that position. But you need it in a more prolonged state. You need it in a further stretched state. You need the strength. So what the eccentric strength training does is it sort of makes a right shift of this force length curve. So you'll have more strength in more prolonged positions, which is suggested to give you a preventive effect for hamstring injuries. So this is sort of the model surrounding eccentric strength training as a preventive tool. And there's been many evidence out there in the literature showing that eccentric strength training has a preventive effect on hamstring injuries. And Christian Torborg said it nicely when he stated that hamstring eccentrics are hamstring essentials. And we also, in current times, have a fantastic way of measuring it. The valve Nordboard is, of course, a way to measure eccentric strength if you're doing a Nordic or a Razor or other types of exercises. So yeah, we can do it, we can measure it, and yeah, literature has shown a significant effect. But ultimately, it's about sprinting. We need to make the translation to sprinting again. I've displayed some of the exercises here, which I use a lot in clinical practice. This is the diver exercise from Carl Askling, which is a fantastic eccentric exercise. You have the glider here, where the leg is sort of sliding backwards and you have to resist the motion on your front leg. The Nordics, an exercise which is known in literature for its effectiveness in a football setting at least, but also in some other settings. Easy to do, a partner exercise, or you can do it alone if you have a Nordboard or a fixation on your ankles. And there are different variations, of course, you could do with regards to eccentric training. And this is only the what, and you can think of many variations with regards to eccentric exercise. These are mainly knee dominant exercises. You also need hip dominant exercises when you talk about a hamstring injury prevention plan. And I think Born did a great study on different types of exercises and the effect on the EMG. So it's really interesting to see which exercises are optimal for hamstring injury prevention. I think the Nordics have the biggest body of evidence, or that's what we know from literature, but there are many variations possible. So like I said, ultimately we need to make the translation to sprinting. And if we talk about sprinting, there are some areas that are really interesting. And first is the muscle architecture. Sprinting has an effect on architecture. Profiling your sprint, so looking at the quality, the quantity of your sprint volumes and your sprinting. And ultimately also the planning of load and the planning of your eccentric exercise within, for instance, a training week schedule, which is really important. I'm going to touch upon these topics a little bit right now. There was, of course, a study on muscle fascicle length by some guys from Australia. They sort of concluded that if you have shorter muscle fascicles, this has an increased risk for hamstring injuries. And then they looked also at eccentric training, and they showed that if you do eccentric training, this has a positive effect on muscle fascicle length, which ultimately gives you a preventative effect on hamstring injuries. So the muscle architecture might be an important aspect of hamstring injury prevention, where you should aim towards longer muscle fascicle lengths. And recently, Jordan Mendigusia showed that not only with eccentric training, but also with sprinting, you can have this positive effect on muscle fascicle lengths. So this makes you wonder, right? Most of the evidence is looking towards eccentric strength training, but if sprinting, which is more sport, ultimately it's the most sport-specific movement, has the same effects. Yeah, this is really interesting for hamstring injury prevention, of course. So looking towards sprinting, not only the muscle architecture matters, but there's also some interesting research about the profiling of injury of sprinting. And JB Morin, who's a researcher from France, and his research group are doing some fantastic work on sprint profiling, and they are looking at the force velocity profile, where they are looking at sort of the balance between force and velocity. And if you have, for instance, two sprinters who have the same time on a 30-meter sprint, and you want to improve these players, some might need some more maximal strength training to get them to be faster or more explosive. And some some other athletes might need more speed training to get faster and more explosive. And it's always a question is, yeah, what does my individual player need? That's what you want to know in a clinical setting. How can I improve my player? Which tools can I give him for optimization of his sprint level or his explosiveness? And again, I have no financial gains from these apps, but these apps, I use them a lot in a clinical setting, and the information from these apps is fantastic. It sort of gives you an individual profile of your player, where you can analyze what this player needs in order to get more explosive. Does he need more strength training? What kind of strength training? Does he need more speed or more velocity? And how can I make that work? It's a really interesting topic, and I think we're going to hear a lot from this in the upcoming years. Yeah, and then of course you need to plan all this, because in an ideal world you would do the prevention every day, but there are also games, there's also training, there's also performance. You don't want your players to have a delayed onset of muscle soreness and then get into the match. So planning is really important, and I think one of the most well-known aspects surrounding the planning of load or monitoring of load comes from Tim Gabbett, who did this study, the training injury prevention paradox, where he sort of defined a sweet spot where you should train, which means that you should train within certain limits. If you exceed those limits, you might have a spike in load during a week cycle. That gives you an increased injury risk. It's a real interesting study and a real interesting concept. But if you're interested in this concept, I would also advise you to have a look at this presentation from Franco Imperilliceri, who had a sort of a critical appraisal on the acute chronic workload ratio. And it's a really interesting topic because he has some other thoughts on the data from which the study by Gabbett came. And I think in conclusion that it's still an interesting concept to look at loads, to look at sprint volumes, and have a gradual build up, and then make your athletes train hard at a certain level but prevent spikes. I think this concept is a good concept, but the data supporting it is still limited, and we need to be critical, of course, in research towards the data. So we need more knowledge, more information about how this works and how we can define load in a clinical setting. From there on, Alan McCall did a study recently, which is also really interesting, about the prevention of muscle injuries, and hamstring injuries were certainly a big topic in this study. And they sort of confirmed what we were talking about right now. In an elite setting, in the Champions League football clubs, sprinting and high-speed running and an eccentric focus on exercises are the most important elements for muscle injury prevention. So these are the main topics to focus on. And what they said in this study is that individualization of sprinting is really important, looking at the player's relative maximum speed, of course. In an ideal world, the coach would also integrate sprinting within the training, which is probably possible right now because we have the GPS and we have the all the advances in load monitoring right now and the technology to look at the sprinting volumes in training. So this should be made possible. And in training, you also want to always look at the 100% worst case scenario. And what is the worst case scenario? That's still difficult. Some clubs have defined it as for instance, in a 90-minute game, the 5 minutes that were the most intensive, and then replicate that in training. But it's still difficult to define. And eccentric should be incorporated in a training week. Like we said, eccentric loading is still important for hamstring injury prevention. But when to do it and in what load and in what volume is still a topic of discussion. It was considered that the match day, 3 days before the match or 3 days after the match, was probably the best day to do it. There's no consensus still about doing it before or after training. So again, for the implementation in a football setting, there are some topics that are still open for discussion, but it gives sort of a body for where we need to go and what we can do in a clinical setting and how it's done right now in the elite football clubs. I'm going to end with announcing a really interesting study that I think everybody that's interested in this presentation would be also interested in this upcoming study. It's being performed by a PhD student, Johan Lati, with Mendigucha, who we talked about earlier, with his multifactorial model surrounding hamstring injuries. And they are trying to do this in a professional football setting. So what they are trying to do is look at different risk factors, the lumbopelvic control, the range of motion or the flexibility, the strength levels, and ultimately also the sprint mechanical output. So all the things that we discussed, they are going to put it in a study and do a risk assessment. So do an individual player testing, and based on the testing, put in the prevention and see if it reduces the risk in a professional football setting. I think the protocol is already really interesting, so you might have some inspiration there, but I'm really looking forward to the data coming from this study, and I think it will have a large impact on the hamstring injury prevention domain in the near future. So to summarize what we talked about today, eccentric strength training, you just need to do it. There's the largest body of evidence is about this topic if you want to prevent hamstring injuries. So definitely work on your eccentrics, fit it within your training schedule, and try to achieve high loads within that training schedule. Do it at the right times, of course. Again, you do not want players to have muscle soreness and get into their performance. But on days where you can train heavy, make this a part of your training regime, and do it in prolonged positions, of course. And with regards to the sprinting, it's important to analyze the fundamentals and to work with your individual athlete based on those fundamentals, which could be on the force velocity profile, but also on technique, on biomechanics. And again, it needs to be fitted with the schedule, and load needs to be managed. So thank you all for looking at this presentation. If you are thinking about learning more about the topic of hamstring injuries, Christian Thorborg released this book about the prevention and rehabilitation of hamstring injuries. And there was also one chapter specifically on hamstring injury prevention in this book. So you might have some inspiration there as well. If this raises any questions, feel free to contact me. I'm always looking forward to discuss this topic more into depth. And that's my presentation for today.
Thank you, Nick. That's a fantastic overview of the work that you've done and that's been done within the literature at the moment, and it touched on some fantastic points. And just a few questions I had in regards to some of the research that you highlighted, especially in regards to low compliance to eccentric training. Do you think that's maybe because people look at the 10-week training program that has been spoken about in the literature and think, oh, I have to do that sort of high volume to have the positive effect? Do you think that's a reason that maybe the compliance is poor?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, because there is some evidence that also states that you can do lower volumes throughout the time. So work with a higher frequency and lower volumes. I think one of the main problems is that prevention is not that sexy, and coaches and players, they just want to play, and prevention is always about something that might happen. If everybody who got injured would know they would get injured, if they wouldn't do it, they would probably do it. But it's about risk reduction, and I think in their minds, players might not be aware enough of their individual risk. So they would think like, it's not going to happen to me, so I don't need it. I can manage to be fit and stay fit without putting in this extra work. And that's sort of a mentality change that we need. So again, like I stated earlier, it's sort of more of a behavioral problem probably than that the program is interesting. And it's interesting because your question is again about the program. Should we adapt the program? Maybe that's one of the thoughts we have. And in sports science, it's good. We're being critical about our own programs. But I think it's time we also say, like, there's so much evidence regarding the value of eccentric strength training in regards to hamstring injury prevention. That there's in sports science, maybe there are not that many topics where there's so much evidence that it works. So yeah, it's time to just do it and see how we can make it work and not proceed on optimizing our program and making it better and better and better again. How much further do you want to go? You know, we know now that it works, so it just needs to be done.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I think the work you highlighted of Joel Preslin, who showed that just maintaining 2 sets of 4 Nordics after you build a volume will maintain strength and muscle architecture. So yeah, I think there's value in applying some higher volumes, but then there's also value in applying small dosages. And as you spoke about, as long as you're doing it, you're going to maintain the benefits, which I think we can all agree on. But the language that you speak about and the behaviour, I think that's a really interesting point, especially maybe in some environments that haven't been exposed to eccentric training and how you go about trying to bring that into the program. If they haven't, do you have any advice for practitioners who are possibly coming into an environment where if they haven't been exposed to eccentric training, the type of language you spoke about, terming performance rather than injury prevention? Do you have any other bits of advice there at all?
Yeah. I could answer this from my personal experience. Of course, I was the head medical of one of our professional football clubs, and I remember getting in there in my first season and sort of being a little bit hesitant with introducing this program because nobody was used to it. I was thinking, like, yeah, the evidence is there, but they're gonna hate it, and and we got some injuries. And in the second season, I thought, like, oh no, man, we need to have a prevention plan, and I need to integrate it. And the guy I need with me to get this integrated is the coach. So I took a lot of time I spent a lot of time introducing the program to the coach, talking about the beneficial effects that we know from literature, that we know from bigger clubs, and that we know from personal experience of other experts. So introducing it to the coach and then asking the coach, okay, right now we are going to do it, but I want you to talk to the players about doing it. And I also want you in the gym when we are doing it. And that made a lot of difference because I'm just a physio, and you can stress that it needs to be done, but ultimately if the coach says something, that's going to make it work better, I think. And you need the whole team, the performance department, the medical department, and also the technical department to support the philosophy you have on injury prevention. And if exercising is a big part of it, it's good to have them there and support it.
I think you make a great point there around the organisational approach to injury prevention and the organisational buy-in that's required to have a successful injury prevention program. If you have coaches and strength staff, sports science staff, fitness analysts all selling the same message that we're trying to improve match availability and improve performance, then all of a sudden no one's talking about injury, and as you spoke about, we're talking about performance, and then as soon as the wins start to chalk up in the column, then everyone's happy.
Exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, creating that buy-in is obviously the first step in that, and by the sounds of things from your experience, it can be a long process, but a beneficial process.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
And what about, you spoke about sprinting and dosage and volume. There has been some smaller studies on running technique and possibly the impact of risk factor there. Do you think that the discussion around core stability and running technique is still something that is important to consider and that we just don't have the right measurement tools at the moment? Or is it that we, want to think that we need to be more specific with all our training, and specific can sometimes be sexy, whereas, as you said, Nordics aren't sexy?
Yeah, so the question was about the running technique, which is really interesting. And because I work on a daily basis with the players on the field, this also has my attention, and I'm really interested in this topic. But the difficult thing with this topic is that there are many questions surrounding it. One is, can we measure running technique? And then the second question is, can we analyze deficits in the running technique? And the third question would be, if we can analyze the deficits in the running technique, are we also able to improve these deficits? And are we able to optimize the running technique? And is this beneficial to the player for his hamstring injury risk profile or for his performance profile? I know I've talked a lot with Jordan Mendegucia, who has some really interesting thoughts on this, and he put some on the protocol paper that I cited in one of the slides. But I think it's really difficult in a clinical setting to look at an optimal running technique, because most individuals have a different running technique, and there's no one single perfect running technique, so it's a difficult topic to analyze what the deficit is related to hamstring injury risk, and how you could alter this with regards to the running technique. So really interesting question, fantastic question, but really difficult to answer as well, I think. And I think it will take a while before we have an answer for you there.
Yeah, I know there's a couple of researchers here in Australia working with Tony Shield and through the ACU, but also QUT, trying to look at that topic of, is running technique a risk factor for hamstring injury? But then also we have to look at injury mechanism that occurs. And so was the player kicking, or were they bending over to pick up the ball in Australian rules football? Or from your perspective in football or soccer, were they having to change direction at high speed at the same time as performing? So that then becomes even more complicated. I know in America they're talking about curvilinear running as well, and whether or not that's a factor as well. So there's definitely some work.
We're doing a fantastic project as well. We have sort of a shorts with EMG, and we are looking at the rotations in the hip joint as well, to see how that influences stress on the biceps fem mainly, and the glutes, and what's happening with acceleration, deceleration, and cutting and agility exercises. So I think there are different places in the world where we are looking at the effects. So maybe within a few years, some of these groups will provide an answer. But still, it's really difficult, because this is about identifying differences, but then we still need to connect this to the injury, of course, to the injury model. And then we also need to provide interventions to optimize the deficits. So it's going to be really interesting. Yeah.
And you spoke about there's still not necessarily full agreement in when the best time to dose eccentric exercise in, but from your perspective, do you have advice around whether or not you believe that pre-training or post-training Nordics, and whether it's match day +3 or -3 are more beneficial or safer dosages?
I think this is sort of my personal experience, but also supported by literature. There's some studies by Small in 2007, I believe. He stated that if you want to optimize the effect of your eccentric strength training, it's better to do it after training, because the effect is bigger if you train in a fatigued state. I think another argument to do the eccentric strength training after training, because is that if you look at the training, you're not going to do these exercises in a cold state. You need to be warmed up a little bit. Doing it after the warm-up and then proceeding to your whole training, yeah, I think players would hate it, and you don't have to be sensitive to what the players like all the time, but I think in advance of training might have some effects if you have some delayed onset of muscle soreness and you take that with you in the training. We don't know yet if this increases your injury risk, but it will certainly have a declining effect on your performance. So from that perspective, my personal preference would be to do it after training. And if you look at a week cycle where you have, for instance, a few training moments leading up to a match, if you have a match, for instance, on Saturday, then 3 days afterwards, so you would have sort of recovery days on Sunday and Monday, and then Tuesday would be the optimal day again to do the eccentric exercises. And we, at the club where I worked, had a discussion about, is 1 time a week enough? Should we go for low volumes or high volumes? We wanted to run with high volumes because this was also the program that we wanted to incorporate. So ultimately, we decided to do it after the match. And this was quite new for the players because after a match, no player wants to, they just want to go to the press and then shower and home. But again, the coach helped a lot here. He had his talk after each game, talking about, of course, the result. And if we would win, it was always more fun. But then after his talk, he would say, okay, and now everybody needs to go into the gym for 10 to 15 minutes and do the exercises. And we went, after each game, we went into the gym, did the prevention program, which was not only the Nordics, it was also the Copenhagen adduction and some stability exercises, of course. But from that perspective of training in a fatigued state and knowing that after a game, you have 2 recovery days, we thought that was the best day, the best second day to do the exercises. Because if you would do them on your recovery day, the question would be, are you recovering? Because you're doing high volume strength exercises on a recovery day. So yeah, from my experience, we did the exercises on match day +3 and after the game itself. And if you had if we had 2 matches in a week, we would only do it once because I think the load of the matches would be high enough to adjust for the prevention.
Well, you're probably getting those sprint exposures and high speed exposures that you're seeing as the other preventative factor in that second match, which would probably be a reason for why you wouldn't have that second. Yep. And so from a sprinting exposure perspective in training, for example, if you don't have 2 matches in a week, are you looking for athletes to get above a certain percentage of their individual max threshold, whether that be 85 or 90% based on GPS? Or
we had the GPS and the performance department, of course, and we talked about training after matches. So because you always have substitutes, for instance, who do less, who might play for 20 minutes or not at all, and they will also have a training the day after, but then you have the first 11 running a program and you have your substitutes running another program within a week cycle. That makes it really difficult. So we try to monitor exposure through the GPS, and we call it topping off at certain points in a week, the high speed volumes, the acceleration, deceleration volumes, and trying to individualize those elements because you also need to, it's really important, I think, if you work with GPS to also set the markers for each individual, because you have fast players, you have players that are not that fast, and the fast players will touch their acceleration volumes really quickly because each acceleration for them is, for instance, a sprint. But if you use the same sprint, the same definition of sprint, for instance, 24 kilometers an hour for the whole team, some players might touch upon that easily, and other players might have more difficulty. So you'll end up with data saying that one guy had 30 sprints in a game and one guy had only 5, for instance. That's a difficult topic. I think if you want to work with GPS, and I think there's a lot is being done in the performance department and in the medical department, but we're still looking towards which parameters are important. Right now, volumes, high-speed running volumes, and acceleration, deceleration are considered important. But the GPS is still not sensitive enough, for instance, to monitor cutting, which also has a significant load, I think, on hamstrings, for instance. So we shouldn't consider it to be the holy grail just yet. We need a lot of more work on optimizing the parameters and the data we're getting. But it's a start, and you can use topping off high-speed sprint volumes in a week as a beginning. But from a personal perspective, I would say I wouldn't rely on it fully, because the data is still not that good, I think.
Yeah, I think it's great advice. And I know Shane Malone and his group have done some work looking at exposure to max velocity and the number of dosages that are possibly have a preventative effect, which then we can also talk about how much of these are also having a performance effect. But like you mentioned, it's very much individualized, and what your max velocity is will also determine how many exposures you may have per game. And then the one thing we can't control for is what happens in the game. And if you are playing a faster speed based on your opposition, or if you lose a key player, then all of a sudden other players are put under greater stress. And so I think the comment you made around training at certain intensities or higher match intensities and preparing for worst case scenarios is a fantastic bit of advice for all practitioners. And we hope that doesn't happen, but at the end of the day, once the game starts, we're just praying that what we've done between games will promote performance.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, well, I really want to
hope.
Sorry,
I said all we can do is hope. No,
that's exactly right. But I think your recommendations today around consistency, compliance, around making sure that you have common language and communication are fantastic, and really enjoy your presentation today, Nick, and the work that you're doing and some of the research you highlighted. So really want to thank you for your time today, and wish you all the best for what's coming, both professionally and personally. Looking forward to the 2040 World Cup and watching your kids run around. Yeah, thanks a lot for your time and your presentation. If anyone wants to get in contact or keep in touch with anything else you're doing, is there a best way for them to do that?
Yeah, just connect with me through Twitter or send me an email, and I'll usually respond quite quickly. So yeah, looking forward to that.
Perfect. Well, no, thank you very much for being part of the VOLD online performance series, and look forward to seeing what comes next for you.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.